He woke before the alarm, before the light, before the city remembered his name. The room was too quiet. Not the clean, disciplined silence he paid for, but the kind that pressed against the ears and made the body listen harder. His head throbbed dully, not with pain but with absence. Memory hadn't vanished. It had stepped aside. He lay still, eyes open, counting the ceiling panels, waiting for his body to explain itself. Something was wrong. Not fear. Not injury. Something lower. He sat up slowly. The silk sheets slid down his chest. That was when he saw it. A dark stain near his collarbone, already dry at the edges. Blood. Not smeared. Not splattered. No signs of a fight. No torn skin. His pulse didn't spike. Stalled. He touched the spot, brought his fingers to the light. Red. Real. His heart beat once, hard, as if testing whether it was still obeyed. He scanned himself. No wounds. No bruises. No pain sharp enough to justify it. This wasn't violence. And it wasn't sex. That realization landed heavier than either. He stood, every movement controlled, the way he'd trained his body to move through chaos without betraying it. The private club suite was immaculate. Expensive minimalism. Nothing broken. Nothing out of place. Even the glassware had been cleared. He remembered fragments now. Music low enough to feel rather than hear. Her laugh brief, unafraid. The way she had looked at him without calculation. That part irritated him more than the blood. He crossed the room, caught his reflection in the mirror. Same face the city feared. Same posture. Same eyes. But something behind them shifted. He leaned closer. The blood on his shirt didn't belong to the night he remembered. It belonged to a night he didn't. He stripped the shirt off, examined it under the bathroom light. The stain wasn't where it would be if someone had struck him. It wasn't where it would be if he'd been careless. It was intimate. Too close. His jaw tightened. He had rules for everything. Intake. Risk. Exposure. Nothing entered his system without permission. Nothing left it without intention. He washed his hands longer than necessary, watching the red swirl down the drain. His body still felt wrong. Not weak. Not ill. Just unsettled. As if something had happened without asking him first. He checked his phone. No missed calls. No messages. That too was wrong. His world did not allow empty gaps. He dressed carefully, choosing dark fabric, steadying himself with routine. The club was already sealing itself behind him as he left, staff averting their eyes, security nodding without questions. Outside, the city waited, indifferent and obedient at once. The sky was still dark, the hour where secrets felt safest. He got into the car. The driver didn't speak. No one did until the phone rang. He looked at the screen. The number made his chest tighten before his mind caught up. Doctor. Private line. No intermediaries. No delays. Before dawn. He didn't answer at first. He watched the city slide past, glass and steel and shadow. His body reacted before his thoughts did. A subtle clench, a warning he hadn't felt in years. This was the moment his certainty cracked. He answered. The voice on the other end was careful. Too careful. Not panic. Measured. As if choosing words that could not be taken back. He listened without interrupting, his face giving nothing away while something cold and precise moved through his veins. The doctor mentioned results. Follow-up. An anomaly that didn't align with his history. With what he had been told. With what he had built his life around. He said nothing. When the call ended, the silence returned, heavier now, deliberate. He stared at his reflection in the tinted window. The blood. The missing memory. The call before dawn. Pieces that did not belong together, but refused to separate. He closed his eyes once, just long enough to feel the weight of it settle. Whatever had happened in that room had crossed a line he didn't know existed. And the question that followed him into the waking city would not let go. Why did his doctor need to speak to him before the sun came up? He told himself she was irrelevant. That was the first lie. He told it calmly, the way he told all of them, folding it into the structure of his morning until it almost felt true. The club had already been erased from the schedule, reduced to a footnote handled by others. Names were replaced with codes. Faces blurred into roles. That was how his world stayed intact. But hers did not blur. Sharpened. She had not behaved like someone who knew who he was. That was the problem. Women in his orbit adjusted instinctively. Their bodies angled toward him. Their voices softened or sharpened, depending on what they thought he wanted. Fear was the baseline. Reverence followed. She had done neither. She had looked at him the way one looks at weather. Present. Uncontrollable. Not personal. He remembered the way she'd asked him a question without apology. No flirtation. No calculation. Just curiosity, unguarded and brief. He had answered without thinking. That detail disturbed him more than the blood. He sat in the back of the car, city moving past like a controlled hallucination, replaying the encounter against his will. Not the physical proximity. The absence of it. She had kept her distance. Not because she was afraid. Because she hadn't needed to close it. That kind of indifference unsettles men who survive on control. He entered his building through the private entrance, nodded once at security, and moved through the space as if nothing had shifted. Meetings were kept. Orders given. Voices lowered when he passed. Everything behaved as it should. He did not. His mind kept returning to the way she'd said his name. Not the one the city whispered. The one written on paper. He stopped mid-step in his office, turned to his head of security without explanation. "Find her," he said. Quietly. No flags. No pressure. Just information. The man nodded once, already understanding the parameters. No one asked why. They never did. The order itself was the first irreversible change. He told himself it was procedural. That after the doctor's call, after the anomaly that refused to explain itself, it was logical to trace every variable. He told himself she was a variable, not a person. He sat at his desk, hands folded, listening to reports flow around him while a part of his attention stayed elsewhere. He remembered her hands. Not what they did. How steady they were. That steadiness implied something he did not like to name. Hours passed. The city climbed into daylight. By the time the file arrived, his patience had thinned into something sharp. He opened it himself. Stage name technically. 26. Origin, incomplete. Employment history. Inconsistent. Nothing unusual there. Clubs bred aliases. But the gaps were too clean. Too intentional. There were no family records past a certain point. No emergency contacts. No digital trail before 3 years ago. Not erased. Simply absent. He leaned back slightly, eyes scanning again. Financials showed survival, not ambition. No sudden influxes. No debts that suggested leverage. No criminal flags. The file should have ended there. Didn't. The last page was blank. Literally blank. A placeholder where additional verification should have been. He felt the first true flicker of irritation then, low and precise. Files did not come back incomplete. Not in his world. He called security back in. Just one question. Why? The answer was careful. The kind people used when facts were thin. Some records were sealed. Not government. Not corporate. Private. He dismissed the man without comment. Sat alone with the file open in front of him. This was the false safety. The illusion that distance still existed. That she was just a woman in a club who happened to be present on the wrong night. That his interest was temporary, procedural, containable. He closed the file and stood, moving to the window. From this height, the city looked manageable. Lines and lights. Patterns that obeyed, somewhere in it. She moved freely, unaware of how close she had come to the center of something that did not let go easily. He told himself again that she did not matter. that she was a coincidence, that whatever had happened in that room would resolve itself once the missing information surfaced. But the question pressed harder the longer the file remained unfinished. Why did her life begin only 3 years ago? And more dangerously, who had decided what parts of it he wasn't allowed to see? Infertility had been his armor. He had built his emotional architecture around it so completely that he no longer remembered choosing it. The diagnosis came years ago, delivered without ceremony by a man who assumed disappointment would follow. It hadn't. Relief had. No heirs meant no vulnerabilities. No one to kidnap. No bloodline to threaten. No future that could be leveraged against him. The city respected men who ended with themselves. He had leaned into that truth and let it hollow him out until nothing unexpected could survive inside. He never married. Never kept lovers longer than a season. Desire was permitted. Attachment was not. That was the rule that kept his hands steady when others lost theirs. It was the rule that allowed him to make decisions without checking his pulse. So when the doctor's voice changed on the call that morning, he noticed immediately. Not panic. Hesitation. That was worse. The man began with context he didn't ask for. A review of recent blood work. A follow-up triggered by the unexplained markers found overnight. He listened without interrupting, eyes fixed on the skyline, body still. The doctor said a word he hadn't heard applied to himself in over a decade. Inconsistency. The silence that followed stretched longer than necessary. He filled it himself. Explain. The doctor did. Carefully. Something had shifted. Hormonal levels inconsistent with long-term sterility. Not proof. Not confirmation. But enough to warrant further testing. Enough to suggest that something previously thought permanent might not be. He ended the call without reaction, thanked the man out of habit, and stood there long after the line went dead. Infertility had been his certainty. It had shaped every risk he took, every distance he maintained. It had allowed him to believe his choices only ever touched himself. Now that certainty had cracked, and the timing was not coincidental. His mind returned to the club without permission, to the way his body had felt wrong before his thoughts caught up, to the blood on his shirt that had not made sense then and made even less now. He sat down slowly, as if gravity had changed while he wasn't looking. Memory reorganized itself under pressure. The night replayed with new emphasis. The brief contact. The way she'd flinched when he'd reached too quickly, not in fear but instinct. The way she'd pressed a hand to her side afterward, as if grounding herself. He had dismissed it at the time. Too many bodies moved through those rooms for every gesture to matter. But now every detail demanded re-examination. He pulled the incomplete file back onto his screen. Her age, her timeline, the 3 years that existed. The years before that which did not. He felt the exposure risk not as fear but as narrowing space. If the diagnosis was wrong, his world remained intact. If it wasn't, everything he believed about himself was already outdated. He ordered additional tests without framing it as urgency. Privacy was emphasized. Speed implied. He did not tell anyone why. Not yet. Control required sequencing. But control had already slipped once, and that was the problem. He realized with a sharp clarity that the diagnosis he'd built his life around had not just protected him, it had excused him from accountability, from imagining consequences beyond himself, from considering the collateral of intimacy. If that excuse was gone, then the rules he'd lived by were suddenly incomplete. He thought of her again. Irritation threading through the thought. She had not asked for this fracture. She had not even known it existed. And yet her presence marked the boundary between who he had been and what he might become if the doctor's words proved true. His phone vibrated with a secure message. Preliminary results uploaded. He didn't open them immediately. Instead, he looked at his reflection in the darkened glass of the window. The face was the same. Controlled. Unreadable. But the identity beneath it felt suddenly provisional. Infertility had been his armor. If it was failing now, it meant something had changed. Not just in his body. In the assumptions that kept his world predictable. And the only variable new enough to matter was a woman who wasn't supposed to. Protection feels different when you didn't ask for it. She realized that on the third night, when the music cut half a beat too early and the lights came up before her set finished. First she thought it was a mistake. Clubs were messy places. Power outages. Drunk managers. Bad timing. But the faces didn't match confusion. They matched coordination. Two men near the bar stood at the same time. Not together. Not looking at each other. But moving with the same intention. She felt it before she understood it. The same way she felt eyes on her now when she crossed the dressing room. The way conversation dipped when she passed a door that had never gone quiet before. She didn't feel hunted. That would have been easier. This was something colder. Measured. As if someone was counting her steps, not chasing them. She finished changing and checked her phone. No messages. No warnings. No threats. That was the part that unsettled her. Whoever was watching didn't need her afraid yet. They needed her compliant. The next shift confirmed it. Her name was removed from the schedule and replaced with a handwritten note taped to the office door. New location. Same time. No explanation. She stared at it longer than necessary, waiting for someone to clarify. No one did. The manager wouldn't meet her eyes. He kept nodding as if repeating instructions to himself. She asked if she'd done something wrong. He shook his head too quickly. Said it was an opportunity. Said the owner wanted her elsewhere. She recognized the lie by how carefully it was delivered. She packed her bag and left without arguing. Arguing required leverage. She had none. The new club was cleaner, quieter, better security. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Security watched her more than the door. They opened paths for her she didn't request. Cleared space she hadn't needed. She felt like a valuable object being relocated, not a person being hired. On stage the lights felt brighter, closer. She adjusted her movements instinctively, not for the crowd, but for the invisible perimeter tightening around her. She caught her reflection between songs and didn't recognize the tension in her shoulders. After her set, she didn't go to the bar. She didn't linger. She left early and walked the long way home, cutting through streets she knew by instinct. The feeling followed. Not footsteps. Not breathing. Presence. The kind that doesn't rush because it doesn't need to. When she stopped suddenly, no one bumped into her. When she crossed the street without looking, traffic paused as if cued. That was when it became undeniable. This wasn't coincidence. Someone had decided she needed oversight. She ducked into a convenience store and waited, pretending to browse. The clerk didn't look up. Outside, a black car idled without headlights. Not hiding. Not threatening. Just there. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her breathing even. Fear made mistakes. She paid, left, and changed direction again. The car moved when she did. Smoothly. Respectfully. As if keeping pace, not cornering her. She reached her building and turned suddenly. The car stopped across the street. The window lowered an inch. A man inside met her gaze briefly, then looked away, as if acknowledging her awareness changed nothing. He didn't signal. Didn't speak. The window rose. The engine cut. She stood there long after, keys cold in her hand, the weight of a decision pressing down without words. Inside her apartment, she checked every lock twice and sat on the floor instead of the bed. She replayed the last weeks, tracing the line backward to the night she couldn't remember clearly enough. The blood. The man. The feeling that something had shifted before she was ready to name it. Her phone buzzed then softly. An unknown number. One line of text. You'll be working at Meridian tomorrow. Transport provided. She stared at it, anger flaring through the fear. He typed back once. Who is this? The reply came immediately. Someone who noticed you were unsafe where you were. That word again. Protection. She laughed once, sharp and humorless, and set the phone face down. She wasn't unsafe before. Not like this. Whatever had decided to intervene hadn't asked her what she wanted. Hadn't even asked her if she was willing. The choice had already been made. As she lay awake, listening to the city settle into its false quiet, one question pressed harder than the rest. Not why she was being watched, but who had the authority to decide she needed it at all. This was no longer a seduction story. It was an exposure story. She understood that the moment his name left her mouth without ceremony, not whispered, not softened, spoken like a fact that had been waiting, they were not alone when she said it. That mattered. The room had people who pretended not to listen, which meant every word would travel faster than fear. She didn't look at him when she spoke. She looked at the table between them, at the glass sweating onto polished wood, at the way power disguised itself as comfort. He had asked a simple question. How did you find me? He expected flattery, and desire, something that kept him centered. She gave him none of it. She told him she didn't meet him by accident. The words landed without drama, and that was what changed the temperature. He didn't react at first. No tightening of the jaw, no shift in posture, just a stillness that made the room lean inward. She continued because stopping would have been worse. She said she was placed, not hired, not introduced, positioned. The night he woke up bleeding into certainty wasn't random. The club, timing, access, all curated. She said it calmly, like a confession made after the fear had burned out. He asked who placed you. She shook her head. Not a name. System. He didn't like that answer, but he recognized it. Systems were harder to kill. He asked when she knew. She told him she knew before he did. Before the doctor called. Before the files came back incomplete. Before surveillance became routine. He watched her closely now. Not with desire but calculation. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The promise of the story he thought he was in broke quietly. No romance. No control regained through intimacy. Just a widening realization that the ground under his life had been rearranged. He asked why now? Why speak? She said because the lie had teeth. Because if he believed he was infertile, he would underestimate what was coming. That word landed harder than any accusation. Infertile. He had built his detachment on it. No heirs. No succession wars. No leverage through blood. It had been his armor, and he had worn it with pride. She watched his face change when the idea cracked. Not fear. Recognition. He asked if she was pregnant. She didn't answer that. Not yet. She didn't need to. The room answered for her. The men's station too far away. The car that never left. The schedule that bent around her body. He saw it all connect in a way violence never had. If the narrative was a lie, then someone had benefited from his emptiness. Someone had needed him unreachable, unclaimed, unanchored. He stood slowly, forcing the room to adjust around him. He ordered privacy without raising his voice. Doors closed. Phones disappeared. The air thickened. He asked her again who benefits. She said the people who feared him most. The people who knew he would burn cities for blood but hesitate for legacy. That was the moral cost, and it pressed in from all sides. If he had an heir, protection became exposure. Every alliance would shift. Every enemy would count days instead of bullets. He had spent years making sure no one could use love against him. Now love was being introduced as a weapon he hadn't chosen. He asked if she consented to this placement. She said no. That was the last clean answer either of them would give. He realized then that removing her wouldn't fix it. Killing the system wouldn't erase the question. Even denying it would be an admission. The only way forward narrowed into a corridor with no exits. He would have to decide who controlled the truth. He would have to decide if blood mattered more than balance. She watched him weigh it, saw the cost carve lines into a face that had been preserved by certainty. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. He said if you're lying you die. She nodded. She had expected that. He said, if you're not, everyone who touched this burns. She believed that too. The danger wasn't in what he would do. It was in what he would protect. As they separated, escorted by silence, one question remained heavier than the rest, echoing through corridors that had already chosen sides. Who benefits if he suddenly has an heir? Pregnancy didn't enter the story with an announcement. It arrived the way real danger always did in his world, quietly, wrapped in procedure, disguised as concern. The confirmation wasn't spoken to her first. It was routed through doctors who didn't ask permission, through blood tests taken while she slept, through schedules that shifted before she noticed the pattern. By the time she understood what had changed, her body was no longer hers in the way it had been the day before. He didn't say congratulations. He didn't say anything at all. He stood across from her in a room that looked temporary but functioned permanent, listening to medical language stripped of emotion. Weak, viable, low risk for now. Every word added weight instead of relief. She watched his face, searching for a reaction she could prepare for. There was none. Only calculation already moving past the present. That was when the doors locked without a sound. Not dramatically. Not like a threat. Just enough to be noticed after the fact. She asked if she could leave. He said not yet. She asked why. He said medical concern. It was the most reasonable lie she'd ever heard. From that moment, autonomy disappeared in increments small enough to argue against individually but impossible to escape as a whole. Meals appeared whether she was hungry or not. Sleep was monitored. Her phone worked but only in certain rooms. Visitors were approved before she thought to request them. He framed every restriction as protection, every delay as precaution. And because the child existed now, because the word patient carried more authority than prisoner, the world complied. Safety arrived without exits. That was the moment she understood this pregnancy wasn't just life. It was leverage dressed as care. He never touched her stomach. That absence was louder than affection. He kept distance but nothing else was allowed to. Doctors spoke to him first. Security answered to him alone. Even the air felt managed. She confronted him once, quietly, because raising her voice would have proven his point. She asked if she was being protected or contained. He didn't answer immediately. He walked to the window, watched the city like it might confess something. Then he said both. That honesty scared her more than the locks. The listener orientation came without warning, delivered in his tone when facts replaced negotiation. Safety arrived without exits. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a condition. The irreversible change settled in when she realized consent was no longer required to justify action. Her calendar vanished. Her job was gone without termination. Her apartment was emptied without eviction. Every tie to her previous independence dissolved under the same excuse. Medical necessity. She wasn't harmed. She wasn't threatened. She was erased softly, and that softness made resistance feel irrational. The false safety tightened when he announced the move. Not relocation. Transfer. A better facility. More privacy. Fewer variables. He said it like a gift. She recognized it as distance from witnesses. The car ride was silent, long enough for dread to mature. She asked where they were going. He said somewhere no one would reach without permission. She asked whose permission. He didn't answer. At the new location, the walls were warmer, the furniture softer, the staff quieter. Everything was designed to calm. That was the trap. Calm made time disappear. Calm made acceptance feel like gratitude. She tried to assert herself by asking questions that couldn't be denied. What happens if something goes wrong? Who decides? What rights do I have? Each answer was correct and incomplete. Doctors would act in the best interest of the child. Security would respond to threats. He would decide what constituted risk. The pregnancy shifted power in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had thought a child might soften him. Instead, it clarified him. Every variable now ran through one calculation. Survival of the asset. Not her. Asset. She tested boundaries once, deliberately. tried to leave her wing without notice. The response was immediate but gentle. A nurse blocked the door. A guard appeared without touching her. He arrived last. Not angry. Disappointed. He said, "You don't need to prove anything." That sentence ended the argument. 'Cause he was right. Proof would only justify more control. The cliffhanger formed when she overheard a conversation not meant for her. Two men discussing contingencies. Words like extraction and relocation and succession floated through the hallway before silence swallowed them. She placed a hand on her stomach, not protectively but thoughtfully. The child had changed the rules, but not in the way she'd hoped. The final question settled in her chest, heavy and unresolved, shaping every breath that followed. Is the baby protection or leverage? The city did not react loudly when the rumor surfaced. It reacted efficiently. Calls that ended early, meetings that were suddenly postponed, cars that took longer routes for no visible reason, and men who had survived 3 decades in violence beginning to count again, not money or territory but timelines, bloodlines, inheritance. He felt it before anyone spoke to him directly. The subtle shift in how his name was used, not as a threat but as a variable. And that was new. She noticed it too, the way staff stopped making eye contact, the way doors closed more carefully behind her, the way conversations died when she entered rooms she had already been cleared to enter. It was not fear of her, it was fear around her, and fear like that always meant valued, and this city, lineage is currency. And the moment that truth embedded itself into the air, the rules changed without announcement. She heard it first through absence. The dancer who usually joked with her went silent. The club manager who once smiled now avoided her entirely, and when she asked why her schedule had been altered again, no one answered with authority, just rehearsed concern. He knew better. He watched the city the way a chess player watches hands, not faces, and what he saw was calculation. People were not asking if the child was his. They were asking what that would mean if it was. An heir in a structure built on elimination was not a blessing, it was leverage, and leverage demanded action. Some would want the child alive to bargain, some would want proof erased before it became permanent, and some would want him destabilized enough to make mistakes that could be exploited. She felt the danger narrow without a single threat spoken, security doubled without explanation, medical appointments were rescheduled without her consent, and routes changed as if randomness itself had been weaponized. She asked him directly once if something was wrong, and he did not lie. He simply said the city had noticed, and that was enough to make her hands shake, because noticing was always the first step. He convened a meeting that night without calling it one. Men arrived who were not summoned and left without being dismissed, and in the gaps between their movements the truth surfaced, not as accusation but as probability. A bounty had been discussed. Not formally, not publicly, but the idea had been floated and tested, and that alone made it real. Not on him, he was too expensive, too protected, too destabilizing if removed, but on potential futures and possibilities, on what could be erased quietly before it grew into inevitability. When the words reached him, they did not come with outrage, they came with confirmation. And he understood then that the city was not reacting to scandal, it was reacting to opportunity. She was moved again. This time not between clubs but between safe spaces she had never agreed to need. And the walls around her became thicker, not to keep threats out but to keep her contained. He told himself it was protection, he told himself it was temporary. But the city does not invest in temporary solutions. She felt it when a nurse she had never met asked questions that were not medical, and when a guard corrected her path inside a building she had already memorized. The child shifted, and for the first time fear was not abstract. She asked him if someone wanted to hurt the baby, and he did not answer immediately. And the delay told her everything. He said finally that some would want to control the outcome and some would want to prevent it, and both groups were dangerous because neither cared about her. She realized then that being inside his world did not make the child invisible, it made the child visible to the worst people possible. People who did not believe in innocence, only timing. People who counted generations the way others counted debts. He felt the pressure lock into place when a name surfaced in conversation that should not have been anywhere near the situation. A man who only moved when wars were being prepared, testing reactions with hypotheticals and silence. That was when he knew the discussion had progressed past curiosity into planning. The city was counting now. Counting days, counting risks, counting bloodlines. And once counting begins, it does not stop on its own. She stood by the window later watching lights move like veins through the dark, and asked the question that had been circling both of them without permission. Is the child safer inside your world or outside it? He did not answer. Because there was no safe answer left, and the city had already begun choosing sides. The offer came without romance or drama, delivered the way all permanent things are delivered in his world. Quietly and without negotiation, he told her there were places where names dissolved, countries where records bent easily, identities that could be folded and burned and replaced before sunrise. He said she would be safe there, that the child would grow without weight attached to its blood, and that the city would forget faster than she expected. She listened without interrupting because she understood offers like this were not kindness, they were containment disguised as mercy. She asked one question only. What happens if I say no? And the room answered before he did, guards shifting slightly, doors sealing more deliberately, air thickening with consequence. He told her the truth but not all of it, said refusing would narrow her options, said staying would require obedience, said the city would not unsee what it had already begun to count. She heard something else beneath his words. This was not an offer, it was an attempt to reduce risk, and she was the variable. He waited for fear, he waited for gratitude, he waited for submission. Instead she said she would not disappear. She said she would not let her child grow up as a rumor or a contingency plan. She said if the city was already counting, then hiding would only make them count faster, and that vanishing would not protect them, it would only make them prey. The refusal did not anger him, it alarmed him, because refusal meant exposure and exposure meant war. She felt control tighten instantly, not through shouting but through decisions being made around her without her consent, schedules rewritten, security recalculated, medical teams reassigned. She realized then that choice was not something she was being granted, it was something she was seizing, and seizing anything in his world came with a cost. The next morning he appeared publicly with her without warning. No press, no announcement, just presence. They walked into a space where her absence would have been safer and her visibility louder than any declaration. She felt eyes lock onto her immediately. Not curious eyes but assessing ones. Eyes trained to measure risk and opportunity in the same glance. She stood beside him as if it were natural, as if she had always belonged there. And the city reacted not with shock but with recalculation. She understood the moment for what it was. Visibility is declaration. And by choosing to be seen she had aligned herself permanently whether she spoke or not. He did not touch her, but the space around them compressed as if he had. His proximity itself a claim that shifted the room. She noticed the subtle reactions, the man who smiled too quickly, the woman who left without greeting, the whisper that traveled faster than sound. The city adjusted its expectations in real time. Some would back off now that the alignment was visible. Others would accelerate because visible targets are easier to plan against. She felt the child move, and for the first time wondered if she had chosen strength or spectacle. He watched the room, not her, tracking who adapted and who stiffened, because stiffening meant fear and fear meant intent. He knew this appearance had closed exits as surely as it had opened others, and that any illusion of neutrality was now impossible. She had not asked for his protection, but by standing beside him she had invoked it. And protection in his world was never passive. It demanded response. It demanded proof. After they left he told her plainly that the city would test this alignment, and that tests would not be symbolic. They would be precise. They would aim for pressure points. She asked if that meant the child, and he did not deny it. The silence that followed was not gentle, it was a narrowing of futures. She understood then that her refusal to vanish had not created safety, it had chosen a battlefield. She had traded anonymity for presence and presence for consequence. And the city was already adjusting its calculations. She stood by a window later watching security lights sweep the grounds and realized that by being seen she had removed the option of quiet survival. The alignment was irreversible now, not because he demanded it but because the city required clarity. She had stepped into visibility believing it was power, but power always attracts force, and force never discriminates. She placed her hand over her stomach and asked herself the question that now mattered more than any offer or threat. Who does her visibility endanger more, her or the child? And the answer did not come quietly. The first consequence arrived without warning, which was how retaliation always announced itself in his world. There were no explosions, no public threats, no dramatic displays meant for fear alone. There were absences, a meeting that never happened, a car that did not arrive, a name that stopped circulating by morning. She noticed the shift before she understood it, security patterns tightening, conversations ending the moment she entered a room, faces smoothing into neutrality that felt rehearsed. This was the cost phase, the part no one narrated out loud because explanation weakened effect. He did not inform her at first, because protection worked best when it stayed abstract, but abstraction dissolved the night she saw blood on the marble near the back corridor, cleaned already yet still speaking. She asked him if it was because of her and he did not answer immediately, which was answer enough. When he finally spoke he did not justify it. He contextualized it, said pressure had been applied and pressure always met resistance. Said alignment invited testing and testing demanded response. She realized then that by being visible she had triggered a chain that could not be paused or softened. Retaliation was not anger, it was maintenance, and maintenance did not consider innocence. She felt the moral ground shift beneath her, not because she doubted him but because she recognized herself inside the mechanism. She was no longer adjacent to power, she was inside its calculations. She asked who it had been and he told her only that it was someone who believed the child could be leveraged. She did not ask what happened to them, she did not need the detail to feel the weight. The city responded the way it always did when blood was spilled quietly. It recalibrated. Fear redistributed. Some threats evaporated. Others hardened. She understood now that protection leaves a trail, and that every step taken on her behalf erased something else. She began to notice how often her safety was cited in conversations she was not meant to hear, how decisions were framed around minimizing future risk to the child rather than justice or restraint. That was when she understood the second shift had already begun. He was no longer protecting possibilities. He was securing outcomes. The official claim came soon after, handled with the same precision as everything else. A legal acknowledgement filed where it could not be reversed, an internal announcement framed as lineage continuity rather than sentiment. The child was named in records that mattered in places she had never been allowed to see. He told her it was necessary, that ambiguity invited challenge, and that clarity would deter most threats. She recognized the truth in that logic and hated it all the same. Because claiming the child officially did not only protect, it marked. It turned a life into a symbol and a symbol into a target. She felt something close inside her as she signed nothing yet consented by standing there, as witnesses adjusted their posture, and treated her differently without changing their expressions. She was no longer a woman under protection, she was the mother of an asset, and assets demanded defense. She asked him if love had anything to do with this decision and he paused long enough for honesty to surface. He said love was inefficient, but attachment was dangerous, and danger required structure. She understood then that love in his world did not prevent bloodshed, it organized it. The moral collapse was not sudden, it was cumulative. A series of small acceptances layered until refusal felt irresponsible. She found herself grateful for outcomes she would once have condemned, relieved when threats were neutralized before reaching her, calm when violence stayed invisible. She recognized the shift and it terrified her more than fear ever had, how quickly survival trained the heart. She realized that protection was no longer something happening around her, it was happening through her existence. The child's claim locked the alignment permanently because bloodline was not something one could step away from without consequence. She stood in the aftermath of quiet retaliation and felt the cost settle into her bones, knowing that whatever love might exist between them now lived inside a structure built on blood. She asked herself the question she had been avoiding since the first disappearance. Can love exist once blood is spilled for it? And the silence that followed felt like another irreversible answer. Morning arrived without announcement, which was how his world preferred resolution. The city woke as if nothing had happened. Traffic resumed, markets opened, voices returned to their normal volume. Yet beneath the routine something essential had been removed. Threats did not vanish dramatically. They were erased administratively. Names struck from channels that mattered. Paths closed so cleanly they appeared never to have existed. She felt the reset before she saw proof. Guards loosening by half a degree. Phones no longer vibrating in bursts of urgency. Doors opening without hesitation. The danger had passed, or at least transformed into something quieter. He did not celebrate, because survival was not victory here. It was maintenance. What unsettled her was how calm she felt standing inside the aftermath, how quickly the extraordinary folded into normalcy. She asked what had been done with the evidence, and he answered without emphasis. Burned. Not because it was illegal but because it was unnecessary. Now. Unnecessary was his word for mercy. She realized then that the city did not remember violence, it absorbed it, resetting its surface while keeping the lesson intact. This was the environment the child would inherit, one where consequences were invisible but permanent. As the morning light filtered through the windows, she noticed documents laid out with deliberate care, final signatures prepared, processes already moving. She recognized the structure even before he explained. Legal channels closing. One by one, options narrowing under the justification of protection. He said it was to prevent future leverage, to ensure no one could use procedure against them again. She understood the logic and felt the quiet devastation settle in her chest, because logic did not soften loss, it clarified it. The last legal path that could free her was not destroyed in anger, it was dismantled with precision. Clauses amended, jurisdictions shifted, authority consolidated. She was not restrained physically because restraint had become unnecessary. She stood there voluntarily, watching freedom be removed in the same way threats had been removed, efficiently, without spectacle. When she asked if there had ever been another way, he did not answer immediately, and that pause carried more truth than reassurance. He told her infertility had once been his shield, no heirs, no attachments, no future that could be threatened. He had built his detachment on that certainty, and mistaken it for safety. What the night with her revealed was not vulnerability, but inevitability. Attachment was not avoided, it was postponed. She listened and understood that the child had not given him a heart, it had given his power a direction. That realization changed the weight of everything. She looked at the city beyond the glass and saw how easily it had reset, how quickly fear redistributed itself into order. She understood now that silence returned heavier than the noise because silence meant the system was satisfied. The violence had done its work and no longer needed to speak. She felt the emotional echo not as grief but as clarity, an understanding that in this world creation was never neutral. Life was not welcomed. It was claimed, integrated, defended with methods that erased alternatives. She thought of the woman she had been before any of this and realized that version had not been killed, it had been rendered irrelevant. Adaptation had replaced choice, and adaptation was rewarded here. She did not cry because tears belonged to a version of herself that believed in rescue instead of alignment. She stood in the quiet aftermath and accepted that attachment did not free him from his nature, it anchored it. He had thought infertility saved him from feeling, and she saw now that it only delayed it until feeling arrived with consequences too large to refuse. By morning she understood the truth without needing him to say it aloud. In his world, creation was not a gift. It was a declaration, and declarations reshaped everything that followed.